Our second topic is structure. So, Gary, do you use the Sidfield structure, or is that mandatory to use that structure, or?
Not really, but I think it's basically Sid Field is like the classic three act structure. So I think it's kind of there in all movies, whether the filmmakers or writers kind of like it or not. It all comes down to the timings and what the audience expects. I kind of really like the Blake Snyder beat sheet method, so that's the one that I use most often. But at the end of the day, when you delete all the kind of titles, he has different titles for each section, so there's like 15 sections. But when you kind of delete those titles, then you just end up with one document that tells the story, hopefully in a really good and entertaining way, and it hits the beats that kind of people expect, I guess. And I think if you can find a really interesting way of doing it where it's not so obvious, then that's obviously really good and that will interest people. But I think like something for a spec script, it's kind of a good idea to follow that, unless you kind of know them really well and you can subvert them in a really good way.
As a U writer, do you have to keep within those kind of paradigms?
I think, yeah, again, it's a new writer doesn't necessarily mean like first script. There could be a new writer on their fourth script. So I think that would be kind of an interesting way to kind of, interesting idea to then see if you can subvert stories in an interesting way, which might be worth doing. Yeah, so.
But if you're the person in charge of deciding whether to take the script forwards, especially for the first 10 pages, they look for specific things. For example, like even the first page, whether you get a good sense of what the story's going to be, and then obviously like 10 pages in, and then they kind of look at specific marks. And I know you hear stories that, because obviously they've got hundreds of scripts to go through, they obviously skip to certain parts, basically, so...
Yeah. I think generally the first 10 pages is a good idea, to make your script readable throughout anyway, and to make it really good and as best as it can be, make it really awesome. And then you've got like the first 10 pages, which is generally a cut-off point for a lot of readers. They will kind of read the first 10 pages so they don't think it's going anywhere. Or if it's a story they've seen 100 times before, then they won't read on. So the first 10 pages is kind of has to really kind of set up character, set up the world, set up the conflict, and all that, and then this kind of story starts going. So like I was mentioning, the proposal, so like within the first 10 minutes they're getting married and he really doesn't want to get married, and so that's kind of interesting, and obviously it's a kind of immediate conflict. You can see that that's going to be like a good story to follow. There's always going to be conflict in that story.
So Stephan, I've heard that you've had some good sort of sessions on structure at the Austin Film Festival. Do you want to?
Absolutely. For example, the first thing, your classic three-act structure, as first thought of by Sid Field or Aristotle, or pretty much any normal human narrative. As humans, we're story-driven creatures. Everything has a bit of a narrative. It doesn't matter whether it's a dirty joke, a limerick, a sketch. There's going to be a build-up. There's going to be stuff happening. There's going to be a climax, and then you've got a wind down. It's not specific to screenwriting. It's specific to how we like to address story, even if there's a subversion like Memento. But even then, if you break it apart, it still does the same thing. You've still got the beginning, you've still got the middle, you've still got the end. Or depending if you read a different book, there's a 5-act structure, or perhaps you like the 7-act structure. I've seen an 8-segment structure: the hero's journey, the save the cat. I'm sure someone's writing yet another different structure, another different theory, yet another way of selling the idea that you must learn structure to fledgling screenwriters. There's a great industry in it. But very often some of those detailed elements of structure are great for criticizing scripts or films after the fact. If they are a crutch during the writing of it, they can be a case of the tail wagging the dog.
Okay, so what section would you say you find the hardest to write? So I suppose beginning obviously is pretty important because you essentially have to suck the audience in. So
Yeah.
is there a lot of pressure with that? So do you find that very intimidating or so what structure?
Kind of. I mean, I kind of like the whole setup. What I find in developing my own scripts is that I'll maybe even do a draft and think this is the kind of page 30 moment or the page 24 moment is actually the page 10 moment. So I have to delete like the whole of first act or something like that, and obviously that's better in the treatment or the outline that you can make those decisions work rather than actually doing it in the script. But yeah, I think for me it's kind of like Act 2 because you have like 60 pages and you have to keep people interested. You have to keep the reader reading. You have to keep the audience interested. You have to make them laugh if it's a comedy. You have to come up with all of these jokes. And it just feels like such a kind of... feels like an hour long script, you know. That's kind of... And then you have the acts either side. But yeah, Act 2 is kind of really interesting. And I've seen like even there's books on... purely on Act 2, you know, those 60 pages, how you fill those 60 pages. So that's kind of interesting. Yeah, that's always kind of been slightly traumatic for me in the writing process.
I think Jenny, I think you've done more sort of feature film writing than TV.
Yeah.
I mean, from the sort of experience you've had and also for experience you've had, I mean, how different does the structure of TV change? Because I suppose you've got... especially with TV, you've got to follow like Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, 4, 5 because of adverts. So
it depends, obviously. I mean, there are people much better qualified to answer, but of course, each channel and where in the watershed and what country it's in will have a different structure of where that is. You know, an HBO is going to have a very different structure to ITV, sadly. I think part of the structural element is with a screenplay, you start off with your protagonist having a view of the world, a wrong view of the world as far as the theme of the film is concerned, and by the end he needs to shift. So, for example, in Finding Nemo, Nemo's dad has to start with the right thing to do, the right way to live my life is protect my son from any danger at all costs. I will not let go. I will not relinquish control. And throughout the film, the whole point is to slowly show him it's okay to let go. And only at the end is that then closed off by going, okay, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to let go a little bit. You can't quite close that off in TV because otherwise it would be very short. You'd be like, okay, well, I've got to start a new loop, a new cycle. You can't quite bring that full conclusion to the end. You've got to keep cycling around, potentially in a new direction.
Do you find structure more of a hindrance, or do you actually find that it actually helps you as far as like, especially when you're stuck with ideas, it kind of, you know, you've got to hit certain points by a certain page. So so do you find it hindrance or a help?
Yeah, I think I know enough now, I think, to not worry about the page numbers, so I kind of know, you know, that something needs to happen by this point or whatever in the page count. But I think for me, it's just a nice... it can trigger things. It can trigger, like, if I go back and read about structure, then it can trigger thoughts and what could happen if, and again, that what-if question, that I know this needs to happen or something like this should happen. And normally the first couple ideas are the most obvious, and then I'll try and think of some more ideas and come up with like the really funny or the really good idea or scene idea that does that, you know. So yeah.
Okay, and Stephan?
I think the idea of structure and the theory of structure obviously is not a hindrance because all narrative does have a structure, but I would find a rigid adherence to a page count limiting. Especially in the initial drafts, where it's just a matter of getting the story out and getting it polished and getting it good.
Well, thanks very much for all those fantastic points. So now we're going to go on to the next section where we're going to be doing another challenge where I'm going to be testing for guests on their 25-word synopsis. And it's going to be another film, not Back to the Future this time. So anyways, see you in a bit.